Elias Rowe reached Magnolia House at the hour when heat loosens paint and the insects sing like hidden wires, and he felt at once that the place watched him. The mansion rose from its own shadow, columns veined with mildew, magnolias flowering too sweetly, like perfume poured over a sickbed. He noticed the shutters first, not open, not shut, but held a finger's width from either, as if the windows were breathing and could not decide to live. Inside, the air had weight. It smelled faintly of formaldehyde under lemon oil, a careful brightness trying to hide a room that had seen too much. The Grafton family received him with smiles that never reached the eyes. Silas Grafton's handshake lingered a second too long. Evelyn's bracelets didn't chime when she moved, and the children stood with the patience of portraits already finished. Elias told himself rich houses often felt staged, but a soft dread burrowed into him the way damp eats wood. He saw mirrors everywhere but faced toward walls or covered by lace doilies as if reflection itself were an offense. A house that won't look at itself is a house with something to hide. He was shown to a guest room that smelled of starch and camphor, the bed made so tight it seemed to hold a body-shaped memory. From the window he saw the east wing hunched apart from the rest, brick darker, eaves crowded by vines that looked like veins running back into the house's heart. No one mentioned it, yet talk kept circling it like birds around a chimney. During supper he learned the rules without hearing them spoken. Servants moved soundlessly and never crossed a pale line in the hall that only Elias seemed to notice. Candles were snuffed in a specific order from center outward, as though light itself could contaminate something if left to wander. Plates were cleaned with citrus, then dried with cloths that smelled of spirits, and when a glass cracked, it was taken away by gloved hands as if it bled. When Elias mentioned setting his easel in the morning sun, he felt the room harden. Silas said he would prefer the west parlor, where the light was consistent, and Evelyn added that the east wing had poor drafts and worse stories, and it was best to leave doorways to people who understood them. Elias smiled and agreed like a polite guest, but he marked the times. Bell at 6, hush at 9, shutters fixed at a sliver all day. He unpacked his brushes with a ritual calm that was part habit and part protection, each bristle a tool and a promise, while the house pressed close and listened. In the hallway a clock ticked without the rise of springs, a steady dead beat, and somewhere a scent of lilies drifted up from the floors, not fresh but preserved. He was here to paint a family, yet the feeling came that he had stepped into a frame already built, and whoever stood still longest would belong to it. Elias began the first morning in the west parlor, where heavy velvet curtains swallowed most of the daylight, leaving the air thick and amber. The Graftons entered together, each settling into place without instruction, their movements deliberate but mechanical, as though some unspoken cue guided them. Silas sat upright in a carved oak chair, his cane laid across his lap like a ruler. Evelyn positioned herself just behind him, her hands clasped over his shoulder in a gesture that suggested comfort but felt more like possession. Margaret and the younger son Thomas stood on either side, their eyes fixed on a spot just above Elias's head, never at him directly. As his pencil scratched the first lines of their likeness, Elias could not shake the sensation that their faces were already rehearsed, the muscles stiff with an unnatural restraint. The stillness was broken only by the faint ticking of a clock, one whose face Elias could not find in the room. During the midday break, Evelyn insisted he take refreshment in the dining room, where he noticed the strangest ornament, a long glass cabinet filled with small birds. Each one was poised in mid-flight, wings spread, but the eyes were sealed with a perfect seam of thread. Tiny stitches so fine they could have been spun by spiders. The beaks had been polished to a soft gleam, and a faint scent of lavender clung to the display. Evelyn smiled thinly when she saw his interest, explaining that Silas believed in preserving moments before they faded, before time can bend them out of shape. She said it as if it were noble, yet Elias felt a chill in the phrasing, as if life was something to be trapped before it could change. That afternoon, as he worked again, he noticed the faintest tremor in Thomas's hand where it rested on the arm of the chair. It wasn't fatigue, it was fear, though fear of what Elias could not guess. Silas's eyes caught his for a brief moment, and the weight in that gaze made him drop his own to the canvas. He realized then that no one in the house ever touched another in passing. Not a hand to a shoulder, not a brush of fingers. Every gesture was deliberate, ceremonial. By evening, Elias was restless. He walked the hall, drawn toward the faint draft that came from the east wing. The corridor there was darker, the wood underfoot creaking with an oddly muffled tone, as if the boards were padded from beneath. At the threshold stood an ornate screen, its fabric embroidered with twisting vines and blossoms, but the flowers were stitched in shades of brown, as if intentionally withered. Before he could step closer, a servant appeared, a thin, silent man who shook his head once and motioned Elias back toward the lighted rooms. He returned to his quarters unsettled, his mind gnawing at the way the family posed, the preserved birds, the sealed mirrors, and the screen that marked the forbidden space. As he lay in bed, the scent of lavender drifted through the shutters, followed by the faint rustle of something small and quick moving through the walls. Sleep came slowly, and with it the uneasy thought that Magnolia House was not just a place where people lived. It was a place where people were kept. Elias woke in the dark, unsure what had stirred him. The air was heavy, dense enough to taste, and somewhere deep in the house came a sound that did not belong. A slow metallic scraping like wire being drawn across wood, followed by a faint, wet whimper. He rose, moving barefoot to the door, each step careful to avoid the boards that groaned. The hallway was unlit, the only glow coming from a seam of light beneath the east wing's forbidden door. He told himself it was the wind, a loose shutter, anything ordinary, but the sound persisted. Scrape, pause, whimper, the rhythm deliberate, patient, practiced. As he neared the source, the light shifted, dimmed, and then the door opened just enough to frame a figure. Margaret stood there in her nightdress, hair loose over her shoulders, skin pale in the candlelight. Her eyes locked on his, wide and unreadable, and for a moment Elias could not breathe. Then he saw it, her lips drawn together with fine silver wire, the stitches so tight they dimpled the skin at the corners of her mouth. She was breathing through her nose in quick, shallow bursts, but she made no move to speak, no sign of struggle. She simply looked at him, head tilted slightly as though studying his reaction. Behind her, something moved in the deeper shadows. Too large to be a person standing, more like a shape hunched low to the ground. Elias opened his mouth to ask. Though what, he didn't know. But before a sound could leave him, Margaret stepped back into the dark. The door shut with a click and the light vanished, taking the scraping sound with it. For several heartbeats, Elias stood frozen in the hall, his own breath loud in his ears. When he finally returned to his room, it was as though he had been sleepwalking. Morning came sharp and bright, the house alive with the usual routine. Margaret appeared at breakfast as though nothing had happened. Her lips were untouched, pink and smooth, her hair pinned neatly. She greeted him politely, even smiling faintly when Silas commented on the progress of the portrait. Elias searched her face for any trace of the girl he had seen in the night, but her eyes slid past him blank as polished stone. He told himself it had been a dream brought on by the house's oppressive air, by too many hours spent staring at unmoving faces. Yet as he returned to the parlor to continue his work, he noticed something he could not explain. The faint glint of silver caught in the morning light, resting in the grain of the floorboards just inside the east wing's door. It was as thin as hair, yet strong enough to hold a shape. Elias did not pick it up. He only stood over it for a moment, feeling the weight of a truth he was not ready to touch, and then turned back toward the parlor, telling himself there were some things in Magnolia House better left unseen. For now. Silas Grafton summoned Elias to his study late the next afternoon. A room dense with the smell of tobacco, polished wood, and something sharper beneath, like a chemical that lingered after cleaning. Heavy drapes blocked the windows, the light falling only in narrow blades across a desk lined with ledgers and a single glass jar holding what appeared to be pale petals suspended in cloudy liquid. As Elias stepped closer, he saw they were not petals at all, but thin shavings of skin, curling delicately as though plucked from fruit. Silas noticed his glance and smiled in a way that showed too much calm. He began to speak of family, not in warmth, but in the measured cadence of a man explaining the upkeep of a prized collection. Death, he said, was an untidy thing. It rotted beauty, blurred features, and stole the spirit's true shape. But his family, the Graftons, had an old solution, a way to preserve both form and essence. He spoke of his grandfather's time in the Caribbean, where he had learned the discipline of the still moment, from men who worked in mausoleums so perfect the dead seemed only to sleep. Those techniques, Silas claimed, had been improved upon here at Magnolia House. Bodies could be kept as they were in their finest hour, skin unmarked, muscles held in a natural pose, the scent of life sealed in oils. He leaned forward, his eyes catching the light, and told Elias that such preservation was not merely an art, it was a moral duty. To let time gnaw at the dead was to dishonor them. Elias listened, his hand tightening on the arm of the chair, aware that this was no idle philosophy. He had seen the portraits in the hall. Each ancestor rendered with the same pallid undertone, the same fixed glimmer in the eyes as if their likeness had been painted from life long after life had ended. He now noticed that in every painting the hands were posed carefully, fingers slightly curled, never limp. As Silas talked, Elias's gaze wandered to the walls around him. Between rows of books stood more framed canvases, each a family member staring outward. The resemblance between their painted expressions and the faces Elias had been sketching that week was uncanny, not just in appearance but in the stillness they shared. It was as if each face had been taught the same rules of how to exist. Silas noticed his attention and seemed pleased, saying the portraits were more than memory, they were anchors. Without them, the work of preservation would lose its meaning. When Elias left the study, the air in the hallway felt colder. Passing a row of portraits, he could not shake the impression that their eyes followed him. Not in the ordinary trick of painted gaze, but in awareness, as though something within the canvas was awake. He thought again of Silas's phrase, the discipline of the still moment, and realized with a slow, heavy certainty that whatever it meant, the Graftons were living it long before they died. Elias spent the next morning sketching in the west parlor, but his focus kept slipping toward the windows that overlooked the sprawling grounds. Beyond the manicured hedges and the iron gates lay a wilder stretch of land, and there, tucked deep among the trees, he noticed a small walled enclosure he had not seen before. In the center was a garden unlike any he had known. No roses or camellias, but beds of pale, waxy plants whose leaves reflected light like porcelain. Drawn by a restless unease, Elias wandered outside under the pretense of studying the grounds for the portrait's background. Up close, the garden's air was wrong. It was cooler than the day allowed, carrying a faint undertone of something metallic beneath the sweet bloom of flowers. Iron benches circled marble basins sunk into the ground, each filled with cloudy liquid that shimmered with an oily sheen. At first he thought the shapes drifting beneath the surface were petals, but as he leaned closer, he saw them for what they were: small animals preserved whole, their bodies frozen mid-motion. A bird caught mid-wing, a rabbit with its paws curled as if in flight, each detail so intact it seemed they might wake if the liquid parted. Their eyes, where visible, were glazed with a faint milky film, giving them an almost dreaming look. A soft, steady humming pulled his attention to a shed at the far edge of the enclosure. The door stood slightly ajar, and inside the dim space he found Evelyn Grafton kneeling beside a broad glass dome mounted on a metal frame. Within it, a newborn lamb lay on its side, its flanks rising in slow, shallow breaths. A thin tube ran from the dome to a brass vessel that hissed gently, releasing a scented vapor into the chamber. Evelyn's hands moved with deliberate care, adjusting a valve as if tuning an instrument. The lamb's breathing grew slower, more rhythmic, and then stopped entirely. Evelyn did not look away. She reached in, smoothing its fur as though it had simply fallen asleep, then began sealing the dome with a ring of wax. Elias backed away before she noticed him, the sound of the humming and the faint scent of lavender clinging to him as he returned to the main path. The garden was not for beauty. It was for keeping things exactly as they were in the moment before death could claim them. It was preservation disguised as tenderness, the kind that could fool even the hand performing it into believing it was mercy. As he walked back toward the house, Elias realized the same stillness he saw in the portrait sessions was here, cultivated like the pale plants in that garden. Magnolia House did not only fear change, and it built altars to prevent it, and he had the sickening sense that the Graftons were tending more than flowers and animals in that hidden place. The west parlor had become a stage, and Elias its unwilling director. Each morning the Graftons entered with a precision that felt rehearsed, their movements stripped of any wasted gesture. They settled into the arrangement Silas had dictated, himself in the oak chair, Evelyn at his shoulder, Margaret and Thomas flanking either side. No one spoke once they were in position. The only sounds were the faint rasp of Elias's brush and the occasional shuffle of cloth when someone shifted by the smallest degree. Even then, the adjustments were mechanical, as if they were not responding to their own comfort but to an invisible hand rearranging them. Elias worked in silence, yet his mind circled the unease that had grown since his arrival. In a normal sitting, fatigue would creep in. The blink of an eye, a tilt of the head, the impatient sigh of someone unused to stillness. But here there was none of that. The Graftons sat like figures carved from flesh instead of stone, holding their poses for hours without blinking. When Elias tested them, dropping a pencil to see if they would glance down, they did not. When he shifted a vase on the side table, they adjusted their gaze in perfect unison without turning their heads. Silas hovered between model and overseer, watching Elias's brush as though each stroke was a step in a ritual. He often paused to suggest changes that seemed less about artistry and more about alignment. A chin lifted a fraction, a hand turned so the tendons showed more clearly. The angle of light altered to catch the hollow beneath the cheekbone. He insisted that the background match the East Wing's grand sitting room, a room Elias had never been allowed to see. When Elias remarked that he could work from life instead of memory, Silas's gaze hardened. He said the East Wing had its own light, and not everyone could bear it. The longer the sittings went on, the more Elias began to feel the portrait was painting itself through him. Shadows fell where he hadn't intended them. The family's skin seemed to lose its warmth on the canvas, and their eyes grew flatter, duller, as if the brush was stripping them of something. More than once he caught himself staring at Margaret's hands, tracing the faint blue lines beneath her skin, imagining how they would look stilled forever. By the end of each day, his body ached in ways he couldn't explain, not from the work, but from the air in the room, which seemed heavier the longer they sat. The scent of lavender had begun to linger there too, faint but insistent, curling in the corners like smoke from a candle snuffed too soon. Elias felt less like a guest now, and more like a participant in something he had not agreed to, trapped in a process that was both art and preparation for something far colder. The storm came without warning, rolling across the horizon in a black wall that swallowed the afternoon sun. Rain began in hard, slanted sheets, rattling the shutters until one near the west parlor tore free and slammed against the siding. The crash carried through the halls, drawing Elias to the corridor that led toward the east wing. Wind forced the double doors at its entrance open just enough for him to glimpse what lay beyond. A strip of marble floor gleaming under a flash of lightning, and the suggestion of shapes standing motionless in the dark. No one was there to stop him this time. The draft pulled at him as though the wing itself was breathing him in, and he stepped over the threshold. The air was colder here, with a faint metallic tang that clung to the back of his throat. The flicker of his candle pushed the shadows aside just enough to reveal the first figure. A man in formal dress, his hair combed neatly, hands folded as if in prayer. But his skin was waxen, his lips sewn with barely visible thread, and his eyes were polished glass. Elias staggered back, the light catching on more figures around the room. A woman mid-curtsy, a boy clutching a toy soldier, an old man seated in a rocking chair, each one perfectly preserved, their clothes immaculate, their poses frozen in small acts of life. They stood in clusters, arranged like actors in an eternal tableau. Some sat at tables set with dustless china. Others appeared to be caught in the middle of greeting someone who would never arrive. Each bore the faint, sweet scent of lavender, masking something darker beneath, the acrid bite of chemicals. On a heavy desk in the corner lay an open journal, pages covered in diagrams of the human body with delicate notations. Beside it was a set of gleaming instruments, hooks, fine wires, narrow knives honed to a surgeon's edge, and strange glass cylinders fitted with tubes. Elias's candlelight fell across a drawing labeled the preservation table, showing a body strapped beneath a frame of silver hooks that held the limbs in tension while a system of pumps replaced blood with a mercury and turpentine blend. The note beneath read, "Best taken at the still point between life and death for optimal result." His stomach turned. These were not memorials. They were trophies kept in a state that mocked the living. In the far corner, a large cabinet stood half open, revealing shelves lined with small, sealed jars. Floating within each was something pale and organic, lengths of skin, finger bones, even entire hands arranged like rare specimens. A bolt of lightning lit the room in full, and Elias realized with a creeping horror that he recognized some of these faces from the newer portraits in the main hall. He backed away, the candle trembling in his grip, every instinct telling him to run. But in the heavy silence, another sound began, a faint rhythmic tapping as though something deep within the wing was testing the limits of stillness. Elias turned toward the noise, but before he could move closer, the storm blew the doors behind him shut, sealing him in darkness so complete it felt solid. Elias did not remember moving, only that he was suddenly deeper in the east wing, the tapping now replaced by a steady hiss. The sound led him to a chamber that felt both workroom and altar. The walls hung with draped fabric to mute sound, the air thick with lavender and the sharper sting of chemicals. At the center stood a long metal table, its surface fitted with channels that sloped toward a drain. Above it hung an intricate arrangement of pulleys and silver hooks, each connected to fine wires that could be adjusted with delicate screws. Glass cylinders lined the shelves, some empty, others filled with a cloudy liquid that glinted with a metallic shimmer. At the table's far end stood Silas Grafton, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, his hands gloved. Between them lay the still form of a young servant girl Elias recognized from the dining room, her eyes open but already glassy. Silas worked with the unhurried precision of a man tightening a clock's gears. A long needle gleamed in his hand as he drew it through the girl's arm, attaching a thin tube that ran to one of the cylinders. He turned a valve, and a pale mercury-colored fluid began to travel into her veins, pushing the darker blood back out into a basin. With each moment, her skin lightened, becoming almost translucent, the blue of her veins fading until they were only faint shadows. Silas murmured to himself in a tone that was almost tender, describing how the process must begin within minutes of the still moment to avoid slackness in the muscles. He adjusted the hooks above her, tightening them until her head tilted at a graceful angle. Her fingers curved as though caught mid-reach. Her lips, slightly parted, were closed with 3 small stitches pulled taut. He smoothed her hair, ensuring not a strand disturbed the composition, then applied a thin oil to her skin that left it gleaming faintly in the dim light. Elias stood frozen, unable to look away. The ritual was not born of sadism's frenzy, but of a collector's devotion. Each step performed with reverence for a private ideal. Silas spoke as though defending a sacred order, claiming the girl would remain perfect now, spared the indignity of decay, kept in the state in which she was most beautiful. It was not murder, he insisted softly to no one in particular. It was preservation, immortality in the only form that mattered. When the work was done, the girl was unbound, her body pliant but held in shape by the wires beneath her clothing. Silas called for 2 servants, silent, pale men, who lifted her carefully and carried her toward a curtained archway. Elias heard a door open, then the faint sound of placement, as if she had joined the silent company he had seen earlier. The hiss of the pump slowed and stopped. Silas finally looked up, his eyes catching the light in a way that made Elias's stomach turn. For a moment, Elias thought he might speak to him directly. But instead, Silas simply returned to the table and began wiping it down with the same careful precision, humming a slow, tuneless melody. The scent of lavender was overwhelming now, clinging to Elias's hair and clothes. He realized then that this was not the first time Silas had performed this act. It was a craft refined over years, one he had no intention of ending. Elias returned to the west parlor the next morning with a weight in his chest that made it hard to breathe. The family was already waiting, seated exactly as before, the arrangement flawless. But something had shifted. As he lifted his brush, he realized the changes were not in the room but on the canvas. The Graftons' faces, once warm with the faint suggestion of life, had dulled overnight. The blush in their cheeks was gone, replaced with a faint gray undertone. Their lips, which he had carefully painted with the soft shine of breath, now appeared dry, tightened, as though the air had been drawn from them. And the eyes had lost their wetness. They were flat now, like polished stones. He tried to correct it with fresh color, but the more he worked, the more the truth bled through. Margaret's hands, which in life were pale but still pink at the fingertips, now showed a faint tracery of blackened veins in the painting, thin lines that spread subtly toward the wrist. He looked at her across the easel. No such marks yet, but his stomach tightened as he noticed the way she sat, her chest barely rising when she breathed. Silas watched closely, as though Elias were the subject and the painting the observer. When Elias hesitated, Silas encouraged him with an unnerving calm, saying he was finally capturing the essence. The word clung to Elias like a curse. He realized now that this was what Silas had wanted from the start. Not the image of who they were, but of what they were becoming. The sessions dragged into long hours, the air growing heavier each time. The scent of lavender seemed stronger now, woven into the fabric of the room, saturating the drapes and even the wood. Sometimes Elias would catch the faintest shimmer in the corners of his vision, like heat ripples in summer air, and he would find himself staring at the family longer than he intended. Their stillness had gone beyond discipline. It had become absence, as if something in them had stepped aside and left only the pose behind. That night, unable to sleep, Elias studied the portrait under lamplight. In the painted background, the east wing Silas had insisted upon, the shadowed archways seemed deeper than he remembered rendering them. Within one, barely perceptible corner, was the outline of a figure seated at a table, skin pale, eyes dark and hollow. He had not painted that figure, yet there it was. As he leaned closer, he thought he could make out the curve of a silver wire across its mouth. The realization hit with a sickening clarity. The portrait was not just recording the family as they sat before him. It was showing them as they truly were, or would soon be. The canvas had become a mirror for the still moment Silas worshipped, revealing the Graftons in their perfected lifeless state. And Elias, whether he willed it or not, was finishing the work. The final sitting came on a day when the air itself seemed reluctant to move, the light in the west parlor dim and heavy as if it had been strained through old cloth. Elias arrived to find the family already in position, their stillness deeper than ever. They did not greet him. They did not shift in their seats. Their skin had taken on the faint, waxy pallor of the preserved figures in the east wing, though their chests still rose in shallow, precise breaths. Silas stood to one side, not seated this time, his hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on Elias as though silently measuring his worth. Elias set to work, but the moment the brush touched the canvas, he felt the air in the room thicken. A faint, sweet scent drifted from somewhere unseen. Lavender, but sharper now, tinged with the acrid bite of turpentine. His vision swam slightly, the edges of the room blurring, and the sound of the brush on canvas grew louder than it should have been, each stroke dragging like a slow pulse. Silas moved closer, his shadow falling across Elias's work, and whispered something low and indistinct. Elias wasn't sure if the words were for him or for the family, but they seemed to steady the room's unnatural quiet. The painting was nearly complete, yet Elias felt as though he were only a vessel for something else guiding his hand. Shadows deepened in places he had not intended, pooling in the hollows of the eyes, around the mouth, under the hands. The skin tones cooled to the gray of candle wax, the lips settling into the faint stiffness of sewn flesh. He tried to fight it, to warm the tones, to paint life back into them, but the colors betrayed him, every hue bending toward stillness. His breath grew shallow, the scent in the air working into his blood. He realized then what Silas had done. The room had been prepared for this moment, the same scented vapor he had seen Evelyn use in the garden shed now filling his lungs. His limbs felt slow, his thoughts unspooling, yet his hand moved without pause. When he placed the final stroke, a thread of white in each eye, not the glint of life, but the cold gleam of glass, something in the room shifted. The Graftons rose as one, chairs sliding back in perfect unison. Their faces in life now matched exactly the faces on the canvas, pale, bloodless, eyes dull. Silas stepped forward, studying the finished work with a look of satisfaction so deep it was almost reverent. He told Elias softly, almost kindly, "Now we are truly eternal." Elias blinked, and the next thing he knew, he was alone in the parlor. The scent still hung thick in the air, but the family was gone. The portrait stood on the easel, finished and perfect, and staring back at him with the stillness of a grave. The house was too quiet, not the comfortable quiet of a place at rest, but the deep, airless stillness of a sealed tomb. Elias called out, his voice startling in the emptiness, yet no answer came. He moved through the west parlor into the halls, each step muffled by thick rugs that seemed to swallow sound. Servants' quarters stood open, beds perfectly made, wardrobes shut. No sign of departure. No trunks missing, no half-cleared drawers. Only absence. Drawn by a pull he could not resist, Elias made his way to the east wing. The doors, always locked or guarded, now stood ajar. The cold air beyond felt heavier than before, tinged with the sweet rot of lilies and the lingering sting of chemicals. The preserved figures were all there. The old man in the rocker, the boy with the soldier, the woman mid-curtsy. But now there were 5 more among them. Silas at the head of a long dining table, Evelyn beside him, Margaret and Thomas flanking the sides, and an empty chair at the end as though waiting for a late arrival. Their skin was flawless in its stillness, their clothes immaculate, eyes fixed in that same dull gleam that was neither life nor death. The table before them was set for a meal that would never be eaten. Silver-polished crystal glasses glinting faintly in the dim light, plates holding food that looked fresh until you saw the faint lacquered sheen sealing it in place. The air was thick with lavender, masking whatever truth lay beneath. Elias's gaze drifted to the wall behind them where his finished portrait now hung. The figures in it were exactly as they sat at the table. The same tilt of the head, the same fixed expressions, the same absence of breath. It was no longer just a painting. It was a mirror holding them in their chosen eternity. For a long moment, Elias could not move. It was as though the room itself waited, offering him a place among them. He imagined Silas's voice, calm and persuasive, telling him that beauty and order were worth the cost, that the still moment was the only moment worth keeping. The empty chair seemed to lean toward him. With an effort that felt like tearing free from something sticky and unseen, Elias turned and left the wing. He did not look back. But as he crossed the threshold, the faintest echo reached his ears, the soft scrape of a chair leg against the floor as though someone had just taken their seat. Elias left Magnolia House in the thin gray before dawn, the sky low with a mist that clung to the road and blurred the tree line. He did not look back. Even without turning, he felt the house behind him. Not just its physical shape, but the pressure of it, like a gaze following him down the rutted track toward the main road. The portrait remained there in the west parlor, but in his mind it was already unmoored from place. He had given it form, and now it had a life of its own, capable of traveling farther than the house's walls could ever reach. He kept his silence in the weeks that followed. Who would believe him if he spoke? And even if someone did, what could they do? Some things, he understood, could not be destroyed without destroying yourself in the process. Yet silence did not spare him from its presence. The scent of lavender refused to fade from his clothes. At night, he dreamt of the long dining table in the east wing, of the Graftons seated in perfect stillness, their eyes just slightly turned toward him, waiting for him to take the empty chair. Months later, in New Orleans, the world narrowed to a single point when he passed a gallery window and saw it. The Grafton portrait exactly as he had painted it, and yet not the same. He stopped in the street, unable to move. The skin tones had cooled into the faint gray of old wax. The eyes had lost their depth entirely, and the shadows in the east wing's background had deepened, curling inward like smoke. The gallery owner told him it had been brought in by a private collector who paid in cash and offered no name. Visitors, she said, lingered in front of it longer than any other piece, staring until their reflections dimmed in the glass. A few returned pale and unsteady, claiming headaches, vivid dreams, or the sense that someone had stood behind them all the while. Within a year, rumors began to form. A clerk who bought the painting for a private social club was found dead, seated in a high-backed chair, his posture too exact to be natural. 2 other members of the club vanished within weeks. The painting was sold quietly, passed to another owner, and another after that. Each transfer left behind a trail of small notices in the back pages of newspapers. Sudden illnesses, disappearances, the occasional unexplained death. Elias read them all, tracing the Graftons' reach as though mapping the spread of a sickness. By 1850, the portrait's legend was sealed. Collectors spoke of it in the same breath as cursed relics and haunted relics, but always in whispers, always with the eagerness of those who believe they can escape the rules that bind others. They said it was not merely painted likeness, but an anchor for the Graftons themselves, a tether to the stillness Silas had worshipped. To look too long into it was to feel your own body slow, your blood thickening, your breath shortening until you matched their pace. Some claimed the figures in the background had grown sharper over the years, and that there were more of them now than Elias had ever painted. He avoided the cities where it appeared, but the dreams followed him wherever he went. The table, the candlelight, the scent of lavender that did not fade when he woke. The chair at the far end was always empty, and he always knew it was meant for him. He began to understand that the portrait did not need him to be near to work its will. It carried the house with it, its air, its stillness, its waiting. He lived long enough to watch the century turn, his body weakening, his hands no longer steady enough to paint. Yet the Graftons did not fade from him. They remained as sharp in his mind as the day he finished their likeness, not aging, not changing, not leaving. And in his final years, he understood the truth of Silas's promise. Immortality was not just possible. It was already walking among the living, framed in oil and canvas, moving from room to room, house to house, taking those who lingered too long. Somewhere in some locked salon or shuttered study, the Grafton family still sat at their table, watching through painted eyes, waiting for the next to join them. In the spring of 1912, Magnolia House was purchased by a New Orleans businessman with grand plans to restore it as a hunting retreat. By then, the once grand estate had been abandoned for decades, its gardens swallowed by vines, the shutters hanging like broken eyelids over the windows. The west wing was weathered and buckling, but the east wing stood curiously intact, its brick uncracked, its roof tight, its windows unclouded by dust. The new owner never entered it himself, preferring to send in hired crews to gut the interior and salvage what they could. Most of the men worked a single day before refusing to return, unnerved by the smell, a faint, sweet rot undercut by something metallic that clung to their clothes and hair. It was during the third week of work that a small team in the East Wing's library uncovered a hidden panel behind a bookshelf. Behind it lay a narrow staircase spiraling downward, the air growing colder and heavier with each step. At the bottom was a windowless room no larger than a storage closet, the walls lined in cedar. In the center sat an oak trunk with tarnished brass fittings, its lid bound by a single loop of silver wire. When they forced it open, the air that escaped was so thick and acrid it burned their throats. Inside, wrapped in layers of oilcloth stiff with age, were a stack of leather-bound journals. The earliest was dated 1824. The last bore the year 1846, the year Elias Rowe had painted the Grafton family. On the first page of the oldest book was written in steady hand Silas H. Grafton. The journals were not the rambling memoirs of a planter, but a manual, a step-by-step account of what Silas called the discipline of the still moment. In calm, methodical language, he outlined the complete preservation process. The precise chemical blend of mercury, turpentine, and lavender oil. The insertion points for fine silver wire to hold muscles taut, the exact window of time after death when the process must begin. Within 3 minutes of the last breath, before the slackening takes hold. Detailed diagrams of the human form filled entire pages marked with neat arrows and measurements. One section, written in firmer strokes, described the role of the portrait. Silas claimed that a likeness painted in the subject's moment of truth would serve as an anchor, binding the preserved body to the ideal state captured on canvas. Without it, he warned, even a perfectly prepared subject would eventually lose form, collapsing into ordinary decay. The artist, whether knowingly or not, became a participant in the ritual, providing the final seal that held the work in place. Interspersed with these instructions were fragments of philosophy. Silas wrote of time as a corrupter, of decay as an insult to the beauty of the living. Death to him was not a natural passage but a disorder to be corrected. His words took on the cadence of a sermon, promising that those brought into the still moment were spared from the rot of hours and the indignity of change. Nowhere did he speak of consent. The find made the local paper for a week, the tone hushed and speculative before the story disappeared entirely. The journals were seized by the state and placed in a restricted archive under the banner of historical preservation. In truth, those who saw their contents feared they might serve as a blueprint for minds inclined to use them. The businessman who owned the property sold it quietly soon after and never set foot inside again. Yet the men who had handled the journals spoke privately of a lingering unease. One said the lavender scent clung to his hands for days, no matter how often he washed. Another swore that in the margin of the final entry, faintly beneath the ink, were words that did not appear in the official transcription. The table is set. One place remains. Magnolia House still stands on the outskirts of what remains of Grafton Parish, its silhouette rising from the overgrown land like the husk of some great creature that has outlived its purpose. The columns lean, their bases crumbling into chalky dust. The paint has long since peeled away, leaving weathered planks that catch the moonlight like dry bone. Kudzu and ivy coil up the brick, swallowing shutters, stretching across gables and creeping over the old roof tiles like green veins feeding a body that should have been long dead. But the house endures. Most in the parish keep their distance not because of trespassing laws, the land is marked but rarely patrolled, but because of something harder to explain. People say it is the way the air changes when you get too close, turning cool and still, as if you've stepped into a sealed room. Some claim that on certain nights, just after sunset, a dim orange light appears in the east wing's windows. Not the warm flicker of a hearth, but a steady glow, like candlelight seen through glass too thick to belong to the modern age. A few who have been close enough say they've heard other things. The faint chime of silver cutlery, the scrape of chairs across wooden floors, or the soft murmur of voices low and measured, speaking in the kind of rhythm that makes you lean in to hear. To most of the younger residents, Magnolia House is nothing more than a local ghost story. They dare each other to approach the porch, to touch the door, to shine a flashlight into the windows. But even those who mock the tales admit the east wing feels wrong. They describe it as walking past a room you know someone is in, only to find it empty, but still feeling the weight of their presence. The story of the Graftons has twisted over the decades into something between legend and rumor. Some versions claim the family fled the country during the war and never returned. Others insist they died in a single night under mysterious circumstances. The truth, or the closest thing to it, is scattered in whispers about the journals found in 1912, their pages locked away by the state. Preservationists have occasionally petitioned for access, citing historical importance. The requests are always denied. Officially, the reason is the fragility of the documents. Unofficially, the state fears what might happen if their contents were released to anyone with the will and the skill to follow them. The portrait of the Grafton family has become a legend of its own. Its whereabouts are unknown, but collectors of the macabre trade stories about its appearances the way others might speak of a stolen masterpiece. In some tellings, it hangs in a private gallery in Europe, shown only to a select few. In others, it rests in the locked attic of an estate in Charleston, brought out only during certain gatherings. Always, the accounts follow the same pattern. A small group of people spends time with the painting, drawn to it in a way they can't explain. They linger in the room for hours, staring, talking less and less, their movements slowing as the days pass. Some are found dead, seated upright in a way too deliberate to be natural. Others simply vanish. Among these rumors, one detail repeats with disturbing consistency. People who claim to have seen the painting in recent years say the background is no longer static. Where Elias Rowe once painted the archways of the East Wing in shadow, there are now shapes in those shadows, indistinct at first, then sharper with each retelling. A man in a high-backed chair. A woman standing behind him with her hands resting on his shoulders. A young girl at one side, a boy on the other. And according to the most recent sightings, more figures beyond them. Their faces half lit as if stepping forward into the light. Magnolia House itself is a paradox. The west side shows its age in sagging beams and water-damaged ceilings. But the east wing remains unchanged. The woodwork is free of rot, the plaster uncracked, the colors of the fabrics rich as though replaced only yesterday. Dust refuses to settle there. More than one urban explorer has tried to document it, and though some bring cameras, the footage always fails. Images are blurred, audio cuts out, and batteries drain in minutes. Those who have been inside describe a dining room set for a meal. Silver-polished crystal glasses catching the light, plates holding food that appears fresh until you see the sheen across its surface, sealing it in place. And always the scent of lavender, not floral but chemical, sharp enough to coat the back of the throat. No one has stayed inside after sundown. Those who tried say the light begins to change, thickening in the corners until the room feels smaller, closer. The air grows heavy, the walls seem to lean inward, and the faint sound of footsteps moves just beyond the doorway. One woman who made it out before dark later admitted she saw the table laid for 6 but only 5 seats occupied. She would not describe the faces she saw. In the county's collective memory, the Graftons are no longer people. They are symbols of something colder. The idea that evil does not always roar or strike with violence. It can arrive in the calm of a parlor, in a voice speaking gently about the virtues of order, in a hand resting lightly on your shoulder while it measures the angle of your jaw. Silas Grafton's words, preserved in his journals, were never those of a man who believed he was doing harm. He spoke of salvation, of sparing beauty from the indignity of change. His cruelty was meticulous, deliberate, and entirely convinced of its righteousness. That is the legacy that lingers in Magnolia House, the evil of control disguised as care, the permanence of possession masked as preservation. Those who know the deeper parts of the story understand it was never about the house itself. It was about the discipline of the still moment. The belief that the perfect state of a thing is worth more than its life. And that belief, as much as the preserved bodies in the East Wing, is what refuses to decay. Today, Magnolia House remains under lock and legal guard, the state citing structural instability as the reason. But the truth is simpler. It is not the building that is dangerous, but what it contains. And what it contains is not entirely bound by walls. Somewhere, whether in the back room of a wealthy collector or hidden in a private archive, the Grafton family still waits inside the frame Elias Rowe painted, unchanged since the day he finished them. They sit in their perfect arrangement, eyes fixed just beyond the viewer as though watching the doorway. And at the far end of their table, one chair is still empty. What do you think? Could this happen again? And if it could, would you notice before the stillness reached you? Before you realized you were already sitting down?